So welcome once again. Tonight we're going to talk dirt cheap telescope for novices. This is a follow-up to dispelling telescope myths from last week. These are the pre-holiday buying season presentations. I'll put them up on the YouTube site for the general public to go, I didn't know that. And, oh, I'm not going to buy one of those. I'll buy one of those. Hopefully people will buy something that is more satisfying. So the first question is, should you even be buying a telescope? And the answer to that is, not initially, you shouldn't, because if you go to your local astronomical observatory, even if it costs you a fee to get in, you will start to be able to talk to people that have spent money on telescopes, that have bought big, expensive telescopes to outfit the observatory. You'll be able to see what a good expensive telescope looks like, costs, what it takes to operate it, maintain it. You'll learn all those irritating, frustrating nuances. You'll learn about why do you have to wait until dark to see Polaris in order to line this thing up? You know, you'll learn a lot. You may even become a member of a local astronomy group, attend presentations, learn a whole lot more. But it can be worth it to do that. Take that approach. Go a little slower than just, I got money, I gotta buy. I know it's a burning hole in your pocket or it's an itch you've got to scratch, but yeah, probably the first approach is go see a real serious amateur observatory where they spend money and talk to some people, get acquainted with the ins and outs, the fantasies and frustrations. So that's the first step. Once you get past that and you still want to buy something, go for a pair of binoculars. I recommend the Celestron Cometrons. I do not make any money off of it. They're 7 by 50 millimeter binoculars. They have a reasonable field of view, so it's easy to point it in the sky and look at things. They're not heavy. They're not going to be able to zoom up and show detail on the rings of Saturn, but you can see that it's a planet with a ring around it. They're just an all-around good set. And the Cometrons go for about $50. So if you're worried about, handing your binoculars to your young child and they accidentally damage them, you're at about $50 instead of over $100 for a serious pair of binoculars that are great, but you probably don't want to hand those to a young kid. And if you're using them yourself, you may find that a 3-pound binocular doesn't sound like much until you want to hold it up to your eyes and look at something that's tiny, and then your hands start getting I can't hold it up any longer. So you let the binoculars hang around your neck on a good heavy strap. Binoculars are next way to go before buying a telescope, because a telescope should cost you a lot more than a pair of binoculars. So how cheap is dirt cheap? We're looking for something that takes very little effort to set up, something that has a good field of view, that doesn't require a lot of maintenance. Get something that, has a hand paddle to it so you can adjust things. Don't be reliant upon your mobile phone, because that software usually has problems and reliability, and you're dependent upon your phone regardless of how much money you spent on your phone, and it's not the latest generation of whatever the app developer created. And there's little things that, like, if you're going to buy a telescope, but don't buy a telescope with a lot of things you don't need. Like your first telescope, don't buy a telescope that includes a camera or a mobile phone adapter, or the one that really gets people is a carry bag or a field carry bag. It's nice to have one of those. Yes, but think about it. That bag did cost something when they were manufacturing the product, and it's an enticement for you to pay a little more for that telescope because it came with a bag. I know, I did this myself. The Orion telescopes that I used to buy, it was nice that they came with a bag. It was convenient, but I ended up putting all the accessories into a inexpensive toolbox because it was much easier to carry that than to carry the telescope in the bag with all the eyepieces and diagonals and filters and covers and all that stuff. And in my first no, absolutely do not. The more colorful a telescope is, when it costs well under $100, the more likely it will be considered a toy telescope, or a telescope that you'll buy very benignly thinking you can give it to your young child, because if the telescope only costs $30 and it gets damaged, destroyed, or ignored, you're not out a lot of money. The problem is it has optical elements, and unless you're supervising all actions of your young child with that telescope, they could go, I wonder what the sun looks like. Not good. So I would just steer clear of any telescope that looks very colorful and is intended specifically for children and has a price tag under $50. I'd say.
And the other problem, Monroe, is that when you have, even with supervision, you have a Hickory telescope like this,
Yeah.
and the child tries to set up, what happens with those telescopes? As soon as you put your face to the eyepiece and touches, the telescope changes position. What is going to damage is the interest in science of your child. That, I think, is even worse. It's like you're destroying the scientific curiosity of a little one because you bought a Hickory telescope that they're going to get frustrated because cannot see a thing. Yep. And they're going to hate astronomy and could cause even bad grades, in the future. You never know.
So these two bullets right here say, if the child does want to do some basic astronomy, like looking at the moon or Jupiter, Saturn, or the Orion Nebula, these toys are likely to be difficult to use and convey that telescopes are not a source of satisfaction. More likely, such a toy will convey that telescopes in astronomy are a source of frustration and dissatisfaction. So they're dangerous and they convey the wrong message, but they are cheap. So I'd steer clear of them. I know they're an incentive because they're so cheap. How can you go wrong? Like, yeah, you can go wrong. And then there's not toy telescopes that are also cheap and not satisfying. So an under $400 non-go-to, non-tracking telescope is likely to be a significant compromise in stability, reliability, durability, and modularity for any upgrades. I've actually owned some of these telescopes, and I will recommend it's not a good first-time buy. It's not a good any buy. The ones that I bought that look like the two on the left, I bought them as basically piggyback secondary telescopes because I knew they were inexpensive. I could throw away the tripod and have a really nice, basically, finder or wide field telescope. And for that, they work fine. But as your primary scope, the ricketiness of the tripod, the fact that as you focus, the optical shift is enormous. The finder that comes with it is kind of a joke. Yeah, avoid these. So if you're paying less than $300 for a telescope, it's probably a price that's a niche market specifically designed for suckering you in with a lower price tag. If you're looking at a telescope that has, instead of 1.25" eyepieces, it has the smaller 0.965 inch, less than an inch diameter eyepieces, the visibility through them is going to be very difficult because you're not bringing enough light out to your eye. If you can't afford something more expensive than, let's say, $400, then I'd say go visit your local observatory, use their very expensive telescopes, even if it costs you a membership, buy a nice set of binoculars, save up your pennies, and then buy a better telescope. It doesn't have to be a multi-$1,000 telescope. It can just be like, about a $700 telescope. But I think then you're going to have something that will be satisfying. So if you're going to buy a telescope that is going to be used by children and you want it to maybe last, then for about $230, you can get that telescope in the upper right. That's a 90 millimeter Max-Sutov Cassegrain. It has a very long focal length, so you get good inherent magnification. If you use a wide field eyepiece, you can throw away the finder, and it has a tabletop mount. So no fancy tripod to set up, no Polaris alignment. They can just point it at stuff they see in the sky, and it'll give them a level of magnification that they can see craters on the moon. They can see cloud patterns on Jupiter. They can see the rings of Saturn. They can see moons of Saturn and Jupiter. They'll see that Uranus and Neptune are itty bitty tiny colored dots. But that's what they can see. I do not recommend an equatorial mount in the like a Celestron 110 millimeter Newtonian, because they're typically a Bird-Jones. They've got a secondary Barlow built into them, which makes it very difficult to collimate. And they're a Newtonian, which means you drive it around in your car, you're going to need to collimate it. And it has a very, very rickety mount. So it's got a lot of slop in it. So I'd say, no. If it looks like a bargain, and it looks like it's got like Jules Verne kind of gears and knobs and stuff, that's not a telescope meant for serious people. Now, obviously, people do buy them, and they spend a lot of time on them, and it takes a lot of effort to keep them operational, maintained, and they will consider ignoring the effort that they put into it because they got a really good bargain. And yeah, it's a good first telescope because they're ignoring all of their frustrations and what they had to learn and what they have to do on a regular basis. So I'd say the one in the upper right is going to be a lot less frustrations. You want one that's quick to set up. An altitude azimuth or AZ mount is quick to set up. No polar alignment needed. You want one with a not a short focal length. You want a longer focal length that gives you the ability to get good magnification without having to resort to less than 10 millimeter focal length eyepieces, which are really hard to see through, or having you spend hundreds of dollars on a Nagler style, like 7 to 12 element, big hand grenade looking eyepiece to give you the level of magnification that you desire. If the telescope looks flimsy, shaky, or moves, you can wiggle it easily, that's probably not something that's going to be satisfying. If it takes too long to set up, you've got to do a polar alignment or a 2-star alignment. That's going to be reducing your satisfaction. So probably want to avoid those. Plus, all those telescopes that require polar alignment or 2-star alignment, how would you look at the moon in the daytime? Because the moon's out in the daytime, How would you look at the moon in the daytime? How would you look at, I don't know, Jupiter or Saturn in the late afternoon? Because as Helen said today, I can see Jupiter, naked eye, in the afternoon sky. Of course, we had a problem with the telescope because I had a cheap telescope tripod. But you need something that lets you see them in the daytime. So you can't have something that requires you to line up on Polaris because you can't see it in the daytime. And you don't want to do a 2-star alignment because in light polluted cities, you have buildings and shrubbery that gets in the way of you lining it up on those popular stars. So something that's altitude azimuth where you only need to line up on one thing, and you can line up on the moon or a planet or a bright star, whatever you happen to have visible. And you want something like a Max-Sutov Cassegrain, so you don't have to do regular collimation adjustment on it in order to have frustration-free observing. You don't want footballs, you want nice round things. So in conclusion, novice astronomy has its satisfaction criteria. Clearly identify your expectations before buying anything. Realize that some of your expectations may be unfulfillable fantasies as derived from pretty pictures associated with the promotion of products. You look at a small telescope and you go, I can see that color picture of a galaxy with my eyes. No, you'll see a little tiny gray smudge if you can see anything from your light polluted city backyard. Visit an observatory, talk to people, join a group, maybe pay a membership fee, maybe pay an admission fee. And if you still want to buy something, start by buying a pair of binoculars instead of a telescope. The cool thing about a pair of binoculars, if you buy a reasonable set that's not too heavy, You can leave them in your car. So if you go, what's that? You can quickly get into your car, go grab your binos and pop them up and look at the sky. So it's a quick way of seeing what's up. Visit an observatory, join a group, maybe buy a pair of binoculars instead of a telescope. Absolutely steer clear of toy telescopes meant for young children. Dirt cheap has a definition, and some products may be too dirt cheap. Most of the stuff in the $300 range is going to be unsatisfactory. And I would say absolutely avoid the Newtonian reflector telescopes on an equatorial mount, specifically if the telescope is in the 114 millimeter range. And if it says it's a focal ratio of f8 as opposed to f4 or f5, because that will have one of those Bird-Jones correctors in them, and you're not going to be satisfied the first time you have to collimate it. So there aren't a lot of choices out there for truly dirt cheap yet satisfying novice astronomy first telescopes. So just because it's cheap, don't just go buy it. Learn what those myths are, and then buy accordingly. But there's constant churn in the marketplace, and here's the ones that I encountered trying to put this presentation together. Products that were available a couple of years ago, let's say pre-pandemic, those products still seem to have web pages that offer them, but they're out of stock for what looks like a year plus. So they're just not willing to fess up to the fact that they can't get them made. They're not available in volume to offer them in their store, or they've actually been discontinued, yet they can use it as a bait and switch. Oh, we don't have that one, but we got this one that's just kind of like it. I know it's going to cost you $80 more, but they're the same thing, right? Price increases, whether they're direct or indirect. The particular 90 millimeter Maksutov Cassegrain reflector that I was accustomed to recommending, that we used to buy just as an optical tube assembly with a couple of eyepieces and a diagonal and no tripod or tabletop mount, you could probably save $30 doing that. But they actually made the telescope $30 more expensive, and you can no longer buy it without the accessories. So by requiring you to buy a packaged deal, they've effectively raised the price by $30. Yeah, stinkers. And then you have companies that go, we don't need to be selling that stuff anymore. Orion discontinued, as in, if you can find the webpage, it says no longer available. The 102 millimeter Maksutov Cassegrain, that was kind of mid-range between the 90 and the 127. That one's been discontinued. But the one that I found amazing was their 127 millimeter Orion branded Mac is no longer available, which was very disheartening. However, if you want to buy a full rig telescope, the telescope with altitude azimuth mount, diagonal, and a couple of eyepieces, for only $180 more, you can buy the Explorer Scientific 127 millimeter Maksutov Cassegrain reflector. So Orion has a company-to-company deal to resell Explorer Scientific, and I guess Explorer Scientific felt that Orion, by offering 127 millimeter Mac, was in competition with the product they're trying to resell. So Orion discontinued their product, the stinkers. And then you have Ioptron discontinuing the Cube G, the Cube Pro, and the Mini Tower in favor of the AZ Mount Pro for hundreds of dollars more. So that's their only AZ mount that they have left. Very disheartening.
And it's a lack of vision,
Yeah.
especially being Ioptron being a young industry. Some of the owners are not that old, and they are not thinking about the next generation of people who continue buying telescope and get into astronomy. If they do that and just having like a super duper expensive almost professional telescopes. What's going to happen is that the clients they have is the clients they will have. And those people have already bought the telescopes they like, they will not continue to buy. So it's really a lack of the business, because if you have an entry telescope, you get the chance of people learning about telescope and then getting interested in buying the more expensive telescope. I just don't understand that kind of it's like basic. You have some you know, administration bachelor's degree getting into the position that he's going to decide to make the company more efficient, and they lose the track of why they opened the company in the beginning of it.
Yeah, I think the best description, and I've seen this in many technology companies, is you forget where you came from. So
Yeah.
the people that started Ioptron were actually BATA, which is an optical fiber switching company, and they made some good money in fiber optic switching. And so they wanted to get into astronomy, and they felt that they can build intelligent telescope mounts that were altitude azimuth, that included a GPS receiver, that would be more cost effective for novices at the entry level than those rickety, equatorial Bird Jones, big Newtonians. They could build very satisfying telescopes, and they did. It took them the better part of 10 years to get it to work right. But once it did, it's like you could go on these used telescope websites, and if you said, hey, I've got an Ioptron Cube Pro, would anybody like to buy it? Those suckers get snapped up within days. Or if you say, hey, I've heard of these Cube Pros or mini towers, and I'm looking to buy one, and there are none available. Now, if it was really a poor quality telescope mount and not very satisfactory, you'd find bunches of them available on AstroMart. But what you find at the low end is all of these 114 millimeter Bird Jones Newtonians on the shaky equatorial mounts, and they spent $300 for it, so they're asking $120 for it, and they'd be lucky to get $50 for it. The shipping costs would be more than the telescope is worth, because people figure it out. But for Ioptron to have no low end, they forgot where they came from. They forgot that new people entering the market, as Helen indicated, need a starting point, and they need a frustration-free starting point. And then when they learn they're really into this and they've got a decent paying job, or they've saved up their pennies, then they'll go buy that expensive, CEM 120 or CEM 60, the big bada boomba heavy mount that will carry a 100-pound telescope, and they can do those kind of things. But if there's no bottom end, how do you get from nothing to a $4,000 CEM 120 mount? It's a giant chasm. And
even like the people who they sell the telescopes now, there's clients. If they buy out the big Bada Boomba telescope, that's the only one they're gonna buy, and that's it.
Yeah,
so
but
that is no more,
when you look at the amount of margin that astrophysics makes on their mounts, and the Ioptron CEM 120 is such a better mount, but it's only about $800 cheaper. What it really means is Ioptron's making a good margin on that mount and still selling it and displacing astrophysics. But just because you sell fewer of them and can make more margin per unit sold, and it makes your bottom line better, it doesn't mean you should kick the legs out from underneath your entry-level market. Maybe what you should do is spin it off to an entry-level market company. So you'd have a bridge from novices to the people with the deeper pockets that can, buy a CEM 60 or a CEM 120. Of course, that's just my opinion.
Monroe, this is a really good presentation. If I'm thinking about to just spill out and tell the people in Scotland that you should do a presentation in that one. I think they're gonna love it because it's very simple. It's just like advice for the beginning, people associated. I think I'm gonna leave a message in their Facebook
Well,
page too to
once I
invite you to do this presentation for
well,
them.
once I get it posted to YouTube, which will probably be the next week or two, because I'll have time off for Thanksgiving, um, then you can just point them to the YouTube presentation. They don't need my smiling, laughing face. They can always shoot me emails if they want to. So,
Okay.
as a result of looking at the entire marketplace from toy telescopes to way overpriced telescopes, this is what I came away with: is about a $700 Celestron 127 millimeter f12 Maxutov Cassegrain reflector telescope on an AZ altitude azimuth go-to mount with tripod. And you buy one of these, you learn how to use it. It doesn't require, constant collimation. Yeah, you can do a 2-star alignment with it, but the current generation of the hand paddle software, and this does come with a hand paddle, does include the ability to do synchronized alignment on the moon or planets, which was a software upgrade from Helen's initial software. And so they've improved it with time, and they realized not everybody's into that 2-star alignment stuff, but Celestron still has to put it in their mounts because they've got a patent. And if they took it away, they couldn't get money from Orion, who bought Meade. Because every time you buy a Meade telescope and it does multiple star alignment, there's a little cha-ching in that price tag that goes to Celestron until their patent runs out, which I think they've got another 7 years or so on it. Comments or questions?
Or suggestions?
Suggestions? And I'm perfectly happy if people have a differing opinion, like, no, you should go out and buy a big light bucket Dobsonian because we've been so successful with them. Okay, now you got to learn the sky. You've got to constantly move the telescope. It's a Newtonian, so you're going to have to constantly do collimation on it every time you transport it. It's going to be a big, heavy tube that may not fit in your compact car. We went through that in Dispelling Telescope Myths last week. It's not that I don't know these things.
Yeah,
I
so
see it all
for
the time.
people who does outreach like me, sometimes we have to teach scouts, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and sometimes we need a bunch of telescopes, whatever they lend to us or whatever club has the telescopes, we use whatever we have. So some people really like the tabletop instead of the Maxitop. They like the tabletop Newtonian telescopes.
Yeah.
They're really good for outreach. They are not that expensive, but there is a disadvantage that they lose the collimation. It means the alignment with the eyepiece and the finder. And every time you travel with them, they lose the collimation. And if you, together with your a Newtonian telescope, you don't buy a laser collimator tool, it's going to be a frustrating telescope. So it's like I have a conversation with another person who does the outreach. And we have like, oh, I prefer this telescope and I prefer this telescope. They use both the tabletop telescope that's easy to carry, is good for children, it's not too expensive, it's get damaged, something like that. It's like reachable for people to use. So it's exactly the same azimuth mount. The difference is that she prefers the Newtonian telescopes and I prefer the Maxitov Cassegrain telescopes. So that's the difference of the idea of it. So I do prefer the telescope that if you don't know nothing about telescopes, and especially for young people who have no patience to wait for collimation to get ready to be observed, the Maxitov Cassegrain is the best. The Newtonian telescopes, you need to have a collimation too, and if you don't have the laser collimation tool, sometimes they are so bent out of position that you need the laser to actually
So
fix them.
You can buy the tabletop telescopes in a couple of different versions. You can buy about $100 80 millimeter refractor, and the refractor is it's a lens-based telescope, no mirrors. It is about an f8 refractor, so it gives you a reasonable amount of magnification. It's very easy to use. There's no collimation required, but it's small. So the next step up at about $120 is the 100 millimeter. So you're just going from 80 to 100 millimeter Newtonian, and it's an f4. It's a short tube, so it has very little magnification. It's almost like you don't even need a finder scope. It's going to give you a 6-degree field of view. So if you're expecting to see details in the weather bands of Jupiter or details in the rings of Saturn, you're not going to see it unless you put a more expensive eyepiece in, a very small aperture eyepiece where it's hard to look through. The next step up from that is going to bump you up to about $230, and that's where you get into the 90 millimeter f13.9 Maksutov Cassegrain. So collimated at the factory, you don't need to collimate it on a regular basis. It's going to have a narrow field of view, so you'll want the finder unless you get a low magnification eyepiece, and it gives you a reasonable amount of magnification. So you are going to see weather bands on Jupiter, light and dark, tiger stripes. You're going to see a black line in the rings of Saturn, the Cassini division. You're going to see the moons of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter. You're going to see really good detail of craters on the moon. And you can, buy a white light solar filter and do what we did today, which is you can look at sunspots on the sun in the daytime. So that's a really good, 90 millimeter at f13.9 is a really good entry-level telescope, but it's going to cost you more than a bottom-of-the-line refractor or a bottom-of-the-line Newtonian. But it's just, given my more than a decade experience of doing this stuff on I'm here to satisfy the public basis, that's what I do. But when I go to public outreach and I really want to wow the audience, so to speak, and it's not a really dark site, it's kind of city, I bring a 150 millimeter f12.5 Maksutov Cassegrain reflector, and I bring it on an ioptron mount, usually IEQ 45 in altitude azimuth mode, because I can carry a heavy telescope, and I bring a heavy tripod on I built it heavy wheeled based tripod. So if I'm in the wrong spot, it's a ioptron with a GPS receiver in it. So I just wheel the telescope over to where the viewing's better, and then I unlock the mount, point it in the right place, lock it back, and it's on target again. So that was tonight's presentation. Let me stop sharing there. Any comments before I stop recording?
Crickets, crickets, crickets.